pure circumstance. When I was a young man, I asked my grandfather what the scariest thing he ever saw was. My grandfather was in his 90s at the time, nearing death. I expected him to tell me some old war story I had already heard a million times, but instead he stuffed his pipe, reclined and said, "Well son, if you're willing to listen I'll tell ya." I sat down. A bit surprised. My grandfather was always a quiet man, and the only time he ever really talked was about war, bills or art, and normally with my parents. He lit his pipe and a rank smell filled the room as the sativa burned. I started my iPhone's camera. Exhaling a massive puff of smoke, he began his story. "Well son, when I was a young boy, in Northern California I was always in the woods, always amongst the trees or climbing up a hill, swimming in the local pond. Things a boy could get up to then. I knew those woods like the back of my hand, probably better. You city slickers may not know this, but you know what you ought to do when there's a weird noise in the forest at night. You ignore it and go back to bed like a reasonable person. As well as I knew those forests, I knew never to be out past sunset. I followed that rule the same way my ma followed Jesus. When I reached 17 I moved out to the city though, San Francisco, picked up a city slicker lifestyle, a city slicker girlfriend and a city slicker job. I went off to war when the time came, and I survived the European theater. Ma passed while I was out at war, and my dad, your great-grandfather, decided that he ought to give me a place to settle with my wife out in the country, get back to my backwoods boy roots along with a nice forestry job. I know you're probably already impatient boy, but I want you to live this story the way I did. The land was a glorious 40 acres, right on the edge of the redwood forest. It was a good-sized house we had, not big enough for all you, but just the right size for me and Darcy. There weren't too many other people around. My closest neighbor, Marcel, was a millionaire, and the next closest fellow was Jonathan, a Klansman type employed by Marcel. The first few weeks we lived there were scenic, perfect even. Then the noises started. Darcy, bless her soul, thought we ought to check it out, but I still knew the cardinal rule: go back to bed like a reasonable person. The redwoods were eerie too, like standing in the halls of giants. I always felt off there, but the pay was good and the house was mine, so we stayed. In the third month of living there, I woke up to a fire burning in our front yard. I gave Darcy my shotgun and rushed to put the fire out. Your grandmother was a black woman and I am a white man. In the 40s that was big taboo, so at first I suspected. Jonathan figured the bastard thought he would be clever and send us a message 1910 style. I decided to pay him a visit with big iron on my hip, except when I went to pay him a visit I found his house half burned. I went from spitting angry to concerned about him. I knocked and knocked, but he didn't answer. I kicked down the door and inside looked barren. There was this static noise. It was truly soul-tearing. I fell to my knees and then it passed. Groaning, I got up and made my way through the back of the house, trying to ignore the awful smells it held. Jonathan was dangling for at least 2 weeks by the time I found him hanging. I came back with the police sometime later. The police out there weren't too concerned about any of it, just got the body out of there and left. Said it was pure circumstance. There were 2 fires. Same, it was pure circumstance I found that body. The next day as I was doing my daily work, I heard that same buzz again. I fell to the ground as it intensified. I thought I saw a figure walk past me, but I passed out. I woke up sometime later in Marcel's house. I wandered a bit, dazed and confused, until I ran into a butler. The house was truly massive too, son, like a small castle. My entire stay there was incredibly surreal, but dinner was the worst. Marcel himself didn't seem real. Dressed up in a white tux, a plastic smile and a monotone voice. His butler was too quiet, obedient. There was true fear in that man's eyes. His maid seemed a bit too meek. She spoke, but the way Marcel eyed her made me uncomfortable. I still had my gun, and my hand never left my hip once. Marcel looked at me like I was dinner, not the disturbingly bland meal in front of us. I left as soon as dinner was over and began looking for a different place to live. I bought a Thompson at that time. I was so paranoid. I still own that gun. I kept it in the kitchen. A week after meeting Marcel in person, I heard that damn buzzing again in the middle of the night. I was so paranoid I broke that rule. I grabbed my Winchester from the bedside, worked the lever action and went outside. I heard rustling in the shrubbery nearby, and unloaded all 8 rounds into those bushes. I heard a man cry out, and I ran and grabbed my revolver. It might seem odd to you, boy, but I was strapped down with guns after everything. Every room had at least one. Anyway, I went outside, revolver raised because I wasn't gonna be bothered to reload. And I found that butler in the bushes. He was begging and pleading for me to just shoot him. I was downright confused. Then the maid came out of the woodwork. I couldn't tell you word for word what they said, but the gist of it was Marcel was some sort of sadist good at holding folks hostage and tormenting them, and he drove old Jonathan to killing himself. It still seemed like they were holding something back, so I told them to take it to the police. I drove them to the station myself. I waited down the road a little ways, and walked into a little shop for a bite to eat. Outside an old man sat with a cup. For a dime I'll offer you some wisdom, he said. I bit and tossed him a coin. I can remember that geezer's speech like it was just told to me. Fear thy neighbor, friend. He's not natural, and beware the buzzing. After hearing a description of my situation, I decided to go check on my home invaders. They never even walked into the station. I drove home truly fearful, and was beyond relieved when everything was okay and my wife was sleeping. I was too scared to work, so I took the week off. I had about 10 grand in savings, and I started moving into a new house in a suburb. Everything was fine until the last day. Everything was out of the house, spare the living room furniture and the guns. I drove up after leaving Marcy alone and heard the buzzing again. I nearly wrecked my Ford. I cautiously walked in with my revolver, and there the bastard was, sitting on my couch. Whatever he said to Marcy had her pale with fear. He pulled a gun out himself when he saw me, pointing it right at Marcy's head. "We won't be needing your gun, old sport. We've got mine here," he said. I dropped my gun and kicked it across the floor. "How about you grab me some coffee, and then we can discuss terms of employment," he told me. It was the scariest thing in the world to me, knowing what he could do, having him in my house, holding a gun to my wife's head. The buzzing was a sort of background noise. Now, I noticed that the back door had been kicked down when I walked into the kitchen, the open doorway looking like an invite to freedom. But instead I opened the cupboard, and grabbed the Tommy gun. I always kept it loaded. The buzzing got louder, and I realized Marcel was getting up. I pivoted and saw him languidly walking towards me. His smug look of satisfaction turned to fear as he saw my gun, and I pumped him with 35 rounds of .32 ACP into his ass, and that white tux was an I-star cred in a few seconds. When the police got around to investigating it, they found 2 skeletons in a burned husk of a mansion. The tests they ran showed that it probably burned sometime in the 1890s. The police chalked it up to a sociopath pretending to be rich. I think that it's something else. He was quiet for a time, until I asked, "What do you think it was, Grandpa?" He took a long drag and replied, "I don't know, but the older I get the more often I hear that buzzing." "Are you scared, Grandpa?" I asked him. He took another drag and replied, "No, I killed the bastard once and I'll do it again." I asked a third, and final question, "Do you really think the buzzing is Marcel?" He stared at the wall for some time before chuckling and saying, "No, it must just be pure coincidence. Now go run along and play now." The recording ends there. My grandpa passed in 2011. Turns out he still owned that property, and my dad inherited it. We're taking a trip up there soon, but I digress. I found my old phone cleaning out my room and getting ready to move out. The story remains as scary as it was to younger me, but it has a new layer of fear, because when I watched the recording I noticed something. Throughout the entire video there is a tall, transparent man, wearing a tattered white tux and a plastic smile that doesn't hide his hate, standing behind my grandpa, as if waiting. There's something in the room with me. A room black as tar is where I sat, or at least it would be had it not been for the dim illumination brought about by the night light in the corner of the area. Its luminous rays would delicately shift colors every few seconds, from red to blue, to green, to red once more. Their presence was a calming one, and yet it took all that I had to keep my body from quivering with raw terror. The outline of something sat about 4 meters in front of me. My eyes stuck to the figure like glue, for I wouldn't dare to strip my sight away from the creature which had frozen me in place with fear. Every time the light would change colors, the intensity of the beams it produced would increase. When the fluorescent shades were most vibrant, it allowed me a glimpse of the features of the monster. A gut-wrenching process I had the incredible displeasure of experiencing. I had thought I was conjuring a mirage in my mind due to the insanity of what appeared in my vision. As I stared at it, I felt as if it peered into my very soul. Its eyes, cold and lifeless, glossed over in a fashion not unlike a thin sheet of fog washing over a field. A thick stream of liquid dribbled from its still lip, and although the coloring of the light which it reflected off of made it hard to tell, its color matched that of a blooming rose in the temperate spring air. As I bore witness to the entity which held my attention captive, I found the hairs on my neck erecting. Not a single window sat ajar, and yet the chills that rattled me were ever present throughout my body. I could feel my muscles tightening when the light shined upon the ghoul once more, revealing the messy hair, the lengths of which exceeded past the monster's chin. The curvature of the body was feminine as far as I could discern. Her skin was as white as the powdery ash that descends from the sky after the faint embers of a once blazing fire diminishes. She bore a petite frame, her appearance bountifully stocked with youth and innocence. She would have been beautiful, had it not been for the eerie, and even threatening mien she displayed. Something was wrong, and the dread that flooded the pits of my stomach made me very aware of the fact. She hadn't made the faintest sound for the entirety of our encounter. The ambience of the night escaped me, leaving the surroundings devoid of all noise. The croaking of the frogs, the whistling of the crickets, and the quaint howls of the breeze which had previously rustled the leaves of the trees halted. At that moment, I felt my beating heart cease movement. My skin went cold, frozen over like a small pond in the crisp winter air. A thick pool of saliva clotted up in my throat, and I forced myself to swallow it down. I gathered all the courage I could muster and broke from my state of paralysis and stepped backward. Never once did my gaze wander from her silhouette, even when I could see her mouth agape, her lips stretched ear to form a perverted grin. I never allowed her once to let my sight waver. My eyes widened, impossibly so. I launched backward away from the creature, crashing into the wall behind me. A deafening creak had shattered the silence of the room. I hurriedly threw open the door and sprinted down the corridors and into the living room. I rushed my way to the back door and grasped the unlocked handle, violently swinging it open. I could hear another door open from the hallway behind me. 2 pairs of footsteps rushed into the room where the monstrous body resided. Blood-curdling screams emitted from the 2 people, one voice deep and masculine, another high-pitched and feminine. Their shrieks were so deafening that I felt the very floor I stood on vibrating with a ferocity unmatched by even the thunder which cracked the skies open in the harshest of storms. First, they screeched in horror, then in pain, and then not at all. I darted into the woods, trees shielding me from the omnipresent moonlight. Millions upon millions of thoughts raced through my mind. Yet, one thought, in particular, stood out above all the rest. The creaking that I had heard which startled me was soon all I could think about at all. You see, the sound didn't originate from the direction of the girl in the room. It came from the closet, many feet away from her.